Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for taking time. Thank you for taking time to be here this morning and today. Looking forward to a lot of good information being shared, and hopefully we can learn together. Couple housekeeping notes. We do have this online, and so there will be some questions that may be getting asked from people outside of this group, but definitely want it to be an open forum where if you have questions, feel free to ask those as we go. So I think to begin this morning, we're going to ask Steve Killpack to kick things off, and so we'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you. Are we on video here? Do I need to stand in front like that? How's my head look? Is it good? All right. Can I back up a little bit? That look good? All right, thank you. I have a tendency to walk around when I talk and wave my hands, so you'll have to keep me centered. I'll forget. All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Kurt for asking me to present. I think this is the third time maybe I've had the privilege to present to Kurt's group. A little bit about my background. I've been a research agronomist with Pioneer, retired from there about 4 years ago, I think. So I've got background in research, do a lot of on-farm testing, work with the Iowa Soybean Association, so I am from Iowa. I also farm, and the last couple years I've been working with drip irrigation and working with Kurt, and we've been installing drip irrigation on our farm. Have a goal to have 500 acres drip irrigated in the next 5 years, and I hope this spring will shape up and we'll get another piece done, and we'll be at around 250 acres of drip irrigation. So we're a small farming operation, but we're trying to constantly drive higher yields. I crop consult with about 200,000 acres roughly, give or take, depending on how excited people are about agriculture, which right now I think everybody's kind of on the fence, and I hope that today you're taking some time to learn a few things and try to determine what we can do to drive higher yields. So this presentation, Kurt wanted me to discuss some of the things we've been doing around uniformity of emergence and how we're trying to achieve this and taking that through V6. Well, I can't take it through V6. I got to take it all the way to the end. But I'm going to get up to about V6 and talk about some of the things that we're trying to accomplish, some of the ideas, some of the things that we've learned. And please feel free to ask questions. This is an open forum and an open discussion. But I do have 120 slides to get through, so I'm going to get started. That's a joke. This is a story of 39 seeds. And the reason that I am telling this story of 39 seeds is because we set out to try to produce 400 bushel corn. And when we sat down to figure out how we were going to raise 400 bushel corn, we knew that we needed approximately 39 to 40,000 plants. So we planted 42,000 seeds, and we ended up with 39,000. And I'm going to tell the story about what we are trying to do to achieve this yield. So starting right, I want you to think about this. And for years, I've discussed with growers about getting started right, and I didn't realize how important this was and how critical it was until the last couple of years when I felt like we'd been shoring up some of our other weaknesses with having the ability to manage water and nutrition more accurately. And at the end of it, there are big rewards. So when we start right, we really need to think about this finish line. I've often posed the question, if you could get every seed to achieve its genetic potential, what would the yield be at the end? And that's the story of these 39 seeds. So germination. What is this process of germination? Seeds are living, breathing organisms. They're in this state of rest, and when the conditions are right, It starts this process, starts this season-long journey to try to achieve maximum yield. When you think about germination, you have to think about moisture. What is the optimum moisture for germination? Well, I've got a few little blurbs up there. Corn kernels must absorb about 30% of their weight. So germination really starts in the presence of water. So once water is imbibed into the plant, that's when germination starts. What are the optimum temperatures that are required? In corn, the optimum temperature is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. How many of us are planting when the soil temperature is 86 degrees? No one, right? And we all laugh about this because we realize that that may be an unrealistic goal. But what is a realistic goal, and how can we influence this germination process? Because this is really, in my opinion, one of the things that we might be missing. This is some work by R.L. Nielsen out of Purdue, and it shows how temperature influences emergence. And you can see that when we're planting in our normal conditions, in this range, it can take 20 plus days to emerge. How many people have experienced that in your farming career? How many people have experienced planting when it gets over 60 degrees and seen corn come up in 7 days? What do you think is better? I like to live over here. Remember that optimum is clear over here. And so what does that mean to us as farmers, and how do we manage through this, and how do we achieve this uniformity? And can we realistically do this? So this is a look at those 39 seeds and variability of germination under optimum conditions, where we had optimum water and we had optimum temperature. So I wrapped it up in a paper towel and left it at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see that we have different lengths of radicals. We have some seeds that have yet to start the process. This variability is going to impact what happens at the end of the year. And this uniformity concept, I've kind of gotten fixated on that. Those of you that know me pretty well, I'll get kind of extreme when we start to talk about some of these things. And I looked at this test that was this perfect situation, and then I thought, man, what happens when we plant at 50 degrees or 45 degrees soil temperatures, and how much deviation do we experience? So how does this variability influence our emergence and ultimately our yield? That's really the question. So here we have this plant right here, and I think everyone's been told over the years that you need to have uniformity. Well, how uniform does it need to be? That's really the question, right? I mean, that was my challenge, because I've often said that we need to have everything up in this many days or this many hours. And I think that changes as we start to look at higher and higher yields. So this was what I set out to do. I wanted to track the emergence and the yield of each individual plant. And this is the first time I've presented this data, because it took me this long to get it together. But looking at how each plant came up, and then what did that individual plant produce? And you'll hear me talk about really focusing on the individual plant yield to drive your per acre yield. That's really the goal. And we need every plant to be the same. So yield variability is really due to emergence, the moisture content of the soil, and the nutritional variability. So this is one of our fields. How many people have looked at a yield map and saw this kind of variability? What I want to discuss is ear weight, and how ear weight influences your yield at the end of the day. So this is 3/10 of a pound of grain and 4/10 of a pound of grain, and the difference in depth of kernel to drive higher yields. How many of us have done kernel counts? How many of you are as good as I am at predicting yield with kernel counts, which I will tell you that I am plus or minus 100 bushels in corn? It's not very accurate. And the reason it's not very accurate is because we have this differentiation in ear weight. We might have the same number of kernels, yet we have a different ear weight at the end of the day. So this is that same yield map, only looking at it from an ear weight perspective. So how good a job are we doing producing maximum genetic potential? So in these areas where we have the black color, you can see where you're encroaching on 0.6 of a pound of grain per plant. And in these areas, we were producing around 1/10 of a pound or a little over that. So not very good, because my seed cost was exactly the same. The return on investment of my seed was dramatically different. And what influenced that? Again, it was the emergence uniformity, the moisture, and the nutrition, which is really what today is all about. How do we manage moisture and how do we manage nutrition? And this uniformity thing is a big part of this. I've shown this slide many, many times, and I think it always makes people wonder, what they're doing on their own farm as we talk about plant population. So at 0.3 of a pound of grain, how many plants take to produce 200 bushel corn? Any guesses? I'll give you a free hat. 37,000 plants. 300 bushel corn is 56,000, and 400 bushel corn is 74,000. How many people are comfortable planting 74,000? Remember, this was our goal, to produce 400 bushel corn. Okay, so we're going to move on to 0.4 of a pound of grain. 200 bushel corn, 28,000 plants. 300 is 42,000. 400 is 56,000. At 0.5 a pound of grain, 200 bushels can be produced with 22,400 plants. 300 is 33,600. 400 is 44,800. What was our yield objective this year? 400. Did we need to produce over 0.5 a pound of grain per plant to achieve 400 bushel? Yes, we did. So here's where I talk about the genetic potential of corn being at about 0.6 of a pound of grain. And it can be above that. 200 bushels, we can do that at 18,000. 300 is 28,000. And 400 bushel is 37,000. Down? Better? All right, thanks. So 400 bushel corn at 37,000 plants per acre. Everybody hear that better? Hear me better? All right. At 400 bushel, we needed 37,000 plants. When we sat down to figure out what we needed for our yield objective, this is really what we were shooting for. We wanted to produce maximum genetic potential on approximately 39,000 plants. And this chart here, you can see that we have a wide range of potential yields at different seeding rates. So you can see at 34,000, that's up to 364 bushel corn, and 24,000 will produce up to 260 bushel corn. So we have tremendous variability. And this is the data that we captured this year in looking at yield in bushels per acre of those 39 seeds. Okay, so these 39 plants. And I took this from seeding, the emergence, and then here are the 39 plants, and here is what we would have achieved in yield if every plant was exactly the same. Okay, so that's how you look at this chart. If every plant was the same as this number one plant, we would have raised 430 bushel corn. And you can see that we have plants with differing yield characteristics. The number 16 plant was only producing 125 bushel corn. 29 plant, and does that make sense to everyone? I'm going to show it to you a little bit differently. This is the individual plant yield of those 39 plants. And again, this is looking at one location. So there's going to be differences within this, but this was the hybrid response and the individual yield of those plants. So you can see that we are producing over 6/10 of a pound, and this is dried weight, 6/10 of a pound of grain, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plants that achieved over the 6/10 of a pound. And then we had a few plants that were at a half a pound, and we had a lot of plants that were living at around 4/10 of a pound. The average ear weight of this example, and in this field, was 0.42 pounds of grain. That's right at 300 bushel corn. Our goal was 400, and we were 100 bushels less than that. Yet I struggle because we were producing plants that were capable of achieving well over 400 bushels. But what was the difference? What was the difference that occurred here? Well, I tracked it by the deviation in hours of emergence. So this is the average plant yield by the hours that it took for each one to come up. And so here's our ear weight, and here's our hours of deviation, 0 being that they came up first, okay? So the first plants that came up, and then an hour and 2 hours and 6 hours and 8 hours, and you can see that in this grouping within 6 hours we had the highest yield on a per plant basis. All the way up through 12 hours, 13, 14, right in that range we had our peak yield. And then after that we started to fall off, and when we were over 24 hours it really started to fall off. And this to me was quite interesting because I wanted to know why this was occurring. Was it the seed? Was it the soil conditions? Did we have dissimilarity within the furrow? And there's a whole host of other things that are occurring. I know the soil temperature when we planted was certainly not optimum, meaning that it was not greater than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It was less than that. And we experienced this great range of yield variability, which to me looks to be strongly associated with how closely those plants came up. And I think this holds true. The thicker you plant, the more critical uniformity of emergence becomes. And there's a variety of reasons that might occur. Here's the average yield, taking it out to an acre versus looking at the individual plant yield. You can see that within this window we were in that 400 bushel range, and then we started to tail off, and down here we were producing in the 125 bushel range for those plants. These would be the late emergers, okay? And most of us would probably be pretty happy if we had, all of our plants up in 24 hours. And I think if we looked at a different seeding rate with maybe less density, we might see a difference in yield. But we're still going to have this variability that still occurs, and I think it occurs because of the seed condition. I think it occurs because of refuge in the bag. I think it occurs because of different genetic influences, seed size, shape. That 30% of your seed weight, if you have a great big round versus a small flat, one weighs more than the other, which means it has to take up more water. So we should be paying close attention to this. And this is really the path that we are on right now, because I believe that we have enough nutrition to produce that yield. We don't have enough uniformity. And somehow we have to try to address this. So how do we improve uniformity? Optimum soil temperatures. And yes, that might mean we need to wait a little bit, especially in the areas where we have the greatest productivity. A uniform seed bed. Now, I'm a no-tiller, and we have cooler soil conditions because we have more residue. So we have to compensate for that. We need to understand what the differentiation is that's occurring within our seed bed. Soil water. Do we know how much water is actually in the furrow where we're placing our seed, and then uniform seeding depth and soil contact. That's going to help us drive more uniformity. Where I think we're missing the boat, these top 3. But you've got to have all 4 of those things to get uniformity. And if we're going to push yields, to 300-400 bushel corn, this has to happen. I don't really care how much nutrition you put into it, because we fed it for 400 plus bushel corn. Why did we achieve 300 bushel corn? My belief is because we set the stage for 300 bushel corn out of the gate with our plant uniformity. So this optimum soil temperature, I want you to think about this. And this varies based on your latitude. But if you plant May 10th versus April 10th, what is the risk? The risk planting early is that you have a lack of uniformity, and the risk of planting later is that you don't have enough sunlight during grain fill to optimize your yield, because that's really what we're after. And I pose this question, and I'm referencing Randy Dowdy and David Hula and the guys that are producing these really high yields. If we could plant at 65 degrees Fahrenheit and tassel on June 21st, what would our yield be? And that's what they're able to do. They can plant when soil temperatures are high, and they can get their plants to tassel, and they can have enough sunlight to fill grain. And I think that is really, really critical. I think we can do it. We just got to work a little bit harder at it. So uniform seed bed. How many of you are no-tillers? Those of you that are no-tillers, how many of you are using a no-till coulter or a row cleaner or both? I believe that we have to use a row cleaner so that we can eliminate residue. Residue is causing a lot of issues, not just in how our seed bed warms, but also in how much residue gets placed into our furrow. And that is a huge issue when it comes to uniformity. If you have residue in the furrow, it's going to wick moisture away. And a row cleaner is going to do the best job of eliminating that. What about soil water? And I'm excited about being able to monitor soil water. And I brought, I'll come back over there. I brought this piece of technology, which is a Smart Firmer from Precision Planting. And why I'm excited about this, I don't know, how many of you have heard about the Smart Firmer? Okay, Smart Firmer allows you to measure organic matter, soil moisture, and how clean your furrow is. Now, what do you think the most important thing in that list would be? Organic matter? Who wants to vote for organic matter? Who wants to vote for how clean your furrow is? What about soil moisture? My vote is soil moisture, then how clean my furrow is, and then maybe I'm going to be intrigued by organic matter. Can you change organic matter in your soil? Maybe over a long period of time, but in that planting season, are you going to change it? Can you change your seeding depth to obtain optimum soil moisture? Yes. And that's what this map is. This is the soil water map, and these red areas, we do not have optimum soil moisture for uniform germination. What do you think is going to change now that we can map this in the furrow? What could we do in that environment? We can plant it deeper. And that is exciting because I will wager that the next technology is going to be the ability to change depth on the go based on where your moisture's at. How important is moisture for germination? That's what starts it. It's the most important thing. To get it started, And then what allows it to move rapidly or slowly? Temperature. So we can gauge the temperature, but I feel like over the years we may struggle to gauge optimum soil moisture. And this is exciting. This is an exciting piece of technology. And if you couldn't see it, that's what it looks like. This optical sensor is going to measure organic matter, and there's a moisture sensor that will tell us how much moisture is in the furrow. This same optical sensor is going to tell us if we have residue. So if you have a furrow that has a lot of residue in it, how uniform is your emergence going to be? Not very. So it measures residue, and I think those are the top two things that this technology is going to do. We're going to test it this year. What about uniform seeding depth? How do you achieve uniform seeding depth? That little handle on this Kinsey planter sets the depth. What does that influence? That influences where these gauge wheels stop, right? Is every row unit the same? No, they are not. Is every component on this planter worn identically? No, it is not. And if we are going to chase uniformity, which this is really going to be my big push for next year, is to make sure that we have uniformity, we also have to make sure that our planting units are at the right depth and everyone is identical. This 2 and 3 setting, or 3 and 3, or whatever you ask your neighbor that they're planting on, is that the same? No, and we need to calibrate every row unit to determine that we are achieving target depth. And I've been going through a lot of planters so far this spring, and one of the things that I find is this gauge wheel arm and the depth stop we should have replaced a long time ago. And maybe everyone in the room is doing their due diligence, but if we don't set the stage for uniformity, and it starts with those simple things, we are going to miss the boat. The other piece, and this is probably the other thing that I'm a huge advocate of, and hopefully I'll be a huge advocate of the smart firmer, is down pressure management. How many people have automated down pressure control on their planter? For those of you that don't, and I was in the same boat, where do you set your down pressure? And the response that I typically get is you set it on stun so that you make sure that it gets in the ground, right? Well, is that where we want to set our down pressure? This is a down pressure map. So this is the applied down pressure. How much down pressure did we need as we went through a field? This red area, we needed over 400 pounds of down pressure. And in this blue, purple area, we needed less than 50. So where do you set your down pressure? And if we don't have technology like this that allows us to adjust on the go, whether it's airbags or hydraulic from Precision or Dawn, I mean, there are options out there. It's increasingly more challenging to set our down pressure. Because this is really what we're trying to achieve. My dad always said when we would go out to plant, he said, you want to scratch your head to try to figure out how the seed got in the furrow. But if you can dig down and find the furrow and easily find the seed, your planter is not doing what it's supposed to. So when I have to scratch my head to figure out how the seed got in there, that's doing a good job. I like to plant a garden when I have time. I don't beat the seed into the ground with a hammer. I like to gently pat it in, and that's no different than your planter. If you have down pressure control, you will apply the minimum amount of force required to maintain planting depth. And that's going to allow for much easier emergence. You might have germination occurring at the same time, but when it comes to emergence, that's where we get into issues with excessive down pressure. And this is what it looks like. And these are the plants that are producing 0 yield, or maybe 1/10 of a pound of grain, and this plant right here is producing 6/10 of a pound. This seed cost me exactly the same as this seed. And so I should strive to maximize the return on investment of every single one of those seeds. When we look at this corn yield gain that we achieve from managing down pressure, it's pretty significant. And it's really significant when you think about it over the variability of a field, because this is the average. So when I think about those areas where maybe the soil is a little too wet, or I've got a hard spot, or I have an area where I need to take weight away, we can see 16 plus bushel yield gains. The average, and this was done by Farm Journal, the average is over 9 bushel, and with airbags, specifically referencing Precision Planting's automated air force, that's at 8 bushel. So if you don't have an automated down pressure system, it is increasingly more difficult to achieve uniform emergence, because you cannot obtain uniform depth. And without uniform depth, you may not have uniform soil moisture, seed to soil contact, and temperature. Those are the drivers of uniformity. So that's the uniformity discussion. And I want to spend just a little bit of time, because Kurt wanted me to take us to V6. So I took us to yield on that example. But I want to reference these nutrient uptake charts. And I want you to think about what goes on in your corn plant's life. And soybeans have the same thing going on. But what is going on with these nutrients? And the next discussion, I believe, is going to be on some of our tissue testing work and some of our fertility concepts. So this is my last slide. And we're going to transition, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have. But I want you to notice something about these uptake charts. When does this nutrient uptake really start to take off? Anybody got a guess at what growth stage? I know you can't see the font up there because it's far too small. But I know you've been farming long enough to pay attention to a corn crop. When does corn really start to grow rapidly? How big is it? And then all of a sudden it really takes off. Well, right here, this is V6. And this discussion right now is getting the crop to V6. At V5, V4, V6, right around in that part of that corn plant's life, it's determining the kernel rows around. And there's this huge uptake that occurs after that. So if your plant is in a deficit at that point in time, what is going to happen to yield? You may lose kernel rows around, but you're definitely going to lose it as we start to assimilate nutrients into the stalks and the leaves. And that's what this represents. So this green bar, that's the leaf. The yellow, that's the stalks and the leaf sheath. The red is the tassel and the cobs. And the blue is the grain. Okay? How much nitrogen do we have to take up? And this is right at tassel. How much nitrogen do we have to take up at after tassel? We have 50%, 25% of which is going to come from the soil, and about 25% from the stalks. So if you can't assimilate enough nitrogen into the stalks, you're going to have a yield penalty. What about potassium? How much does it need to take up? About 25%. And about half of that is coming from the leaves and the stalks. It's remobilizing those nutrients that it's stored up. And I think that's important. I think that's really important to take into consideration when you think about feeding your crop. We need to make sure, and I feel like maybe we didn't do this as well as I would have liked, that we didn't feed the crop well enough as it was rapidly growing. And I think that might be reflected in some of the tissue results that we're going to show, but we still have some work to do there. But if we're going to achieve maximum yield, we have to make sure we hit this target and look at it for all of the nutrients. How much is taken up into that plant as it goes through that rapid growth stage. And that starts to occur after V6. To raise 400 bushel corn, how many pounds of potassium do we need? We'll need about 440 pounds. Where is it going to get it? It's got to come from the soil. It's got to come from you. It's got to come from somewhere. Does that corn plant need more nitrogen or potassium? It needs more potassium. And I think you'll see that where we have some of our best yields, we've got higher K test levels. But it's got to get stored into the stalks and the leaves. Does anybody have any questions on anything that was presented? Yes, sir.
There's an attachment, planter attachment that goes on John Deere planters that essentially uses the early riser system from International, uses this to form the closing and the furrow. Does that have advantages over the press wheels that John Deere uses? According to, of course, the people that brought that piece of equipment makes all the difference in the world. What is your experience? What is your experience?
So the question was around Case IH's early riser closing wheel system compared to a traditional press wheel system like on a John Deere or a Kinsey. And to answer that, I have yet to find a closing wheel that I am extremely satisfied with. That is an attachment that I use on my own personal planter. And I do see advantages to that. It still has some disadvantages. We have to contour a lot. So that's one of the problems that we have with our closing wheel systems is that we don't track that well. The other disadvantage is that when you have double disc openers, like a True V on a John Deere or a Kinsey, those are opposing forces. So you're going to have a tendency to have more sidewall compaction compared to a case planter. But that's something that you can eliminate as you move into managed down pressure. But is the closing wheel going to make all the difference? No, it's just one piece that's going to help drive more uniform emergence. Is it going to be better than a standard closing wheel? In my opinion, yes, it will be.
How significant is it? I know it's only one part of the puzzle, but we're talking about something that's significant enough to make a change that would be worthwhile.
I think there's some independent research that will look at a lot of different closing wheel systems. That's what I reference, but there are advantages of, and not specifically to that closing wheel system, but of other closing systems. It depends a little bit on your soil conditions, soil moisture, clay content, etc. But they are showing 3 to 5 bushel differences versus your standard, what I would call a non-no-till setup. That's something that we could probably look at, the specific yield response. I would think it would be, somewhere in that range. Then you'd have to determine how many acres are you going over and maintenance of that component, but it's not going to be 20 bushel. Yes, sir.
You talked about auto down tools. Can you give a little idea?
So the question on managing auto down pressure. So in the example of precision planting, the term margin is used to calculate the extra weight that's being carried on the gauge wheels. And to set that, you would want to apply enough extra margin to maintain ground contact. And Again, it depends on the soil conditions. If we're in good planting conditions, you should be able to run at 99 to 100% ground contact and have less margin. So that might be 40 pounds. If you get into wetter soil conditions, the soil has more resistance to it, you might need 80 pounds of margin. And if you're willing to sacrifice some ground contact to not create a inhibited root system, then you would be looking at 90, 95% ground contact, and you would still be in that 30 to 40 pounds of margin. But you are going to sacrifice depth if planting conditions are not optimum. Any other questions? I've answered them all. You're speechless. All right, we're in good time, I think. So I'll be back. You'll think of something, I'm certain of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah. And just to recap on a couple things that Steve talked about, that emergence, I would say, as we work with growers, and everybody is always setting that yield higher. If you're dry land and you're 200 or 150 and you put a drip system in and you want to add 100 bushel to that, and now you're at 250 or 300, and now you want to get to 350 or 400, the number one issue that I see is emergence. And that's why this topic was first, and that's why I think it's so important, because if you do not get this right, you've already shot yourself in the foot, and there's nothing we can do with the drip system to get you over that yield hump if this didn't get done right. So I can't stress the importance of that. Plant your high-yielding fields last. That's a key takeaway. Plant your drip field last. It needs to be warm. It needs to be perfect conditions. Maybe that's not last, but plant it when it's perfect. Don't push it early. Don't try to get it out there early. We've got all summer to grow the crop. We want to get it out as early as we can to take advantage of sunlight, but don't push it. One thing we are working on that we hope to have in place this season are some camera systems. So those of you that have the NMC DC controller with a modem in your field, you have a cellular connection there already. And so we're working on getting some cameras that we're going to purchase and put in your field, if you're willing to let us do this, and document your emergence. How long is it taking for your crop to get out of the ground? So Travis has been working on that, and we hope to have about 10 of those systems out this spring and put in some fields to start documenting what that emergence looks like, and that way we can, at the beginning of the season, already set a yield trajectory. If your emergence was all over the board and we already know that your yield is capped at 250, there's no reason to throw 300 bushels worth of nutrients out there. So I think there's some things like that we can do to help make your system more economical and put your inputs where they belong.